Hi, it's Sunday, April the 5th, and I'm here today to give your weekly update on an overall snapshot of the numbers both in the U.S. and around the globe as we continue to struggle to deal with this ongoing pandemic. And we're trying to just give you a big picture look so that you have, without any real bias here, any political agenda, just a good snapshot of where we are right now in seeking to address this issue and answer the question, are we making any progress? First of all, a quick look at the United States. 2 weeks ago, I told you that if you started with 2 people when the virus first came to the United States in January, how many times would we have to multiply that times 2? How many times would it have to double to cover the whole U.S.? And the answer was 28. On the day that I shared that with you 2 weeks ago, we were at the 14 doubling point. It had doubled 14 times. It would have to double 14 more times to cover the whole United States. So where are we today? A week ago, that had increased to just over 16 doublings. And the rate of increase had been doubling about every 3 days 2 weeks ago. A week ago, that had slowed just a hair to about every 3.5 days, and it had doubled a total of 16 times. Today, we're at a place where social distancing has made an impact. It has slowed to the point that about every 5 to 5.5 days, the number of cases, diagnosed cases in the United States is doubling. And so we stand today where it has doubled a total of a little over 17, between 17 and 17.5 times. Again, 28 is that point, or really more specifically 27.5 times is when we would have saturation of the whole U.S. So we're at about 17.5 times, 27.5 would be total saturation. So we're about 10 doublings from that point. We've slowed it down some. The changes that you made in behavior have slowed it down to about every 5 to 5.5 days, but we still haven't done nearly enough, because if you play that on out in the future, the current rate of doubling, 5 to 5.5 days, if you look 3 weeks down the line from today, 5 million Americans would have the disease, and if you go 6 weeks from today, that number would be 80 million, and 10 days later, you would have total saturation of the U.S. again. So we have made progress, but we've still got a ways to go. Now, I want to quickly compare that to what's going on in the world, and what you'll see is, from again, a big picture perspective, if you look at all of the diagnosed cases in the world, it took 67 days for the entire world to get to the point that there were 100,000 diagnosed cases. It's interesting to compare this to the United States. It took 67 days for all the countries of the world to hit 100,000. It took 68 days for the United States to reach its first 100,000. The second 100,000 for the world, it took 11 more days, 67 and then 11 to get to 200,000. In the U.S., it took 68 and then just 5 more days in the United States to hit 200,000. For the third 100,000 in the world, remember 67 days, 11 days, and then it took 4 days for that third 100,000 in the U.S. It only took 3 days to hit that third 100,000 number in our country alone. And of course, yesterday, we crossed a line globally where now an additional 100,000 cases are being added every single day. And of course, that number is just ramping up day after day. Now, when we look at the number globally, there's one number that seems to me to be of more concern than any other, or of great concern, and it's the number that no one seems to be talking about, and it's the mortality rate globally. If you've been following the numbers that Johns Hopkins University has been producing, one of the numbers that you'll see on the Worldometer chart every day that doesn't seem to be getting anyone's attention is the death rate. The mortality rate, which a true mortality rate can only be measured deaths against recoveries, deaths against the total number of cases. That's all that you can count in that, because those who are still sick, we don't know what their outcomes are going to be. We're at the place today where we've had a total of about 320,000 closed cases of COVID-19 globally, and of those 320, 66,000 resulted in death. That's a really, really high rate. Now, 3 weeks ago, when we started doing these videos, the mortality rate, as measured by Johns Hopkins University, was 7%. And in 3 weeks, that has grown from 7% to 21%. 66,000 deaths out of 320,000 closed cases. That's an alarming number. Now, we're being told by authorities again and again that when everything is said and done, that the mortality rate on this disease is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1%. Some of the political leaders are saying maybe even a little bit less. But my question for you is this: how do you get 21% down to 1% or less? And I want you to realize just how real these numbers are. There are still about 900,000 diagnosed active cases of COVID-19 in the world today. If you could wave a magic wand over all those people and say, nobody else dies, everybody else gets well, and you measure the 66,000 deaths against all cases, all closed cases and all open cases, everyone miraculously cured, you would still have a mortality rate of 5.4%. And if that number doesn't alarm you, let me just remind you, 2.5% was the mortality rate for the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, and that killed somewhere between 20 and 100 million people globally in the span of just a couple of years. I've been saying to you all along, the mortality rate on this disease is going to wind up landing somewhere between 2 and 4%. That's a great cause for concern, because that will mean that there will be far more deaths globally than what we're currently being told. The numbers plugged into the model saying it's going to be a 1% death rate. And there are many medical leaders who are saying the same thing, that it's going to have a much higher mortality rate. The truth of the matter is, to get from that 21% that we're looking at today on closed cases to any kind of reasonable number, there's really only two explanations for how it can be that high today. One is that in the end, the true mortality rate that we'll find when all is settled is going to be much higher than 1%. It's going to be somewhere between 2 and 4%. And the other thing that's a sobering realization is that this means that there are far, far more cases than what we have actually diagnosed. We are told right now that there are almost 1.25 million diagnosed cases in the world today, but in order to get from a mortality rate that actually is showing at 21% today, to get it down to even 2 or 2.5%, that has to mean that there are actually today 10 or 12 million current cases of COVID-19 globally in order to even bring that number down to something that we can begin to grapple with. And what the leading medical minds have told us is, if the number of cases that we can see is like an iceberg, and it's the portion of the iceberg that we can see sticking out of the water, but the vast majority of this iceberg is submerged, they've said, we don't think that's the case with COVID-19, but if it is, we've got a much bigger problem than what we realize. Far more people are going to die. It's going to be far more widespread than what we had imagined. And so, unfortunately, the numbers seem to indicate that that's the likelihood of where we are. Higher mortality rate and a far greater number of undiagnosed cases out there. Now, that may all sound like just a lot of gloom and doom. What's the point of that? I just want to encourage you in two ways. Number one, I want to encourage you, we are making a difference. We are beginning to slow this down in the United States. But beyond that, I need to tell you, we're not doing enough. Just a portion of Americans practicing social distancing, or those of us who are practicing it, just doing it part-time, is not going to work. The nations that have truly been able to slow this disease have had to take radical steps. If you and I are going to stop this disease in its tracks, unfortunately, we're going to have to act like everyone who lives outside of our household has the plague. Think and act as if they do. For the next 6 to 8 weeks, do everything in your power to cut yourself off from any physical contact with people outside of your home. If you have to be out, wear gloves, wear a mask, but do everything you can to avoid contact with other people. Do your part in that regard and pray. Call on the power of God to stop this thing and to save us from this. If we work like it's all up to us and pray like it's all up to God, we'll see a much better outcome. I'm Mark Price, reminding you to stay safe, stay in touch, and please stay home. And remember that you're loved.